Anthony and I are proud to affirm the EU should automatically offer membership to any state that successfully secedes from a current or former EU member state. Before we move on to our plan, let's define some things. First, automatically offer membership means basically what it means. It's self-explanatory. It allows secede states to bypass admissions requirements once independent. Basically, if a country like Scotland were to secede from the UK, it would automatically be granted into the EU. Our plan is just like the resolution. The EU will automatically make it their official policy to automatically offer membership to any state that successfully secedes from a current or former EU member state. With that in mind, let's move on to our first contention, EU goals. Before moving on to the countries and why we should implement them, let's understand and provide some context behind the EU and what their goals are. The EU was formed with several goals in mind, among them being that to promote peace, establish a unified economic and monetary system, and promote inclusion and combat discrimination. As a corollary to this, one of the political goals of the EU in broad is the absorption of all European continent states in a sort of United States of Europe. In other words, the EU needs a broadly united Europe if it wants to achieve its goals. Its goals of providing this unification, this security, economic and monetary system, and inclusion cannot happen if the EU does not have all of these broadly united states combining together to achieve its goals. This has a few impacts. If the EU was to successfully achieve its goals, if it wasn't able to successfully achieve its goals, we see a few impacts. First, of political instability. Tensions between new states and the ones they secede from will likely be high. The EU will need to be in control of both. Basically, if there isn't a unified system in the EU, that means tensions between a country in the EU and out of the EU, or both in the EU, will continue to happen. And this is a big problem, because political instability, as we know it, often leads to political problems, which in some cases leads to war, violence, sanctions, economic recessions, and things like that. This is a broad problem because it exemplifies and implies the fact that political instability could be worse for the long run. The second impact of it is the economic instability if it doesn't reach its goals. The EU needs Europe to be a single block of goods for goods to pass through. The EU does not want another country that they have to negotiate trade deals with, as with the ease of Britain. We really want the EU to have a successful way of providing that unification and providing that economic aspect that it hones for. This economic aspect isn't possible if there are current conflicts, because then trade deals have to be put in place and years upon years of diplomacy will have to be enacted. This is not only inefficient, but it also provides problems for the country that wants to become its own sovereign state. But also, we can thirdly look at the example of Russia. Without Europe, it would be in the interest of newly formed secessionist states to turn towards Russia. Basically, what happens is if a state is not part of the EU and they're conflicting with one of the states, instead of working with the EU, they're going to be working with Russia. This alternative is incredibly important in today's resolution, because Russia has already shown interest in supporting secessionist movements within Europe. For instance, in Catalonia, their goal is to undermine the EU. Russia is working with these secessionist states in order to undermine the EU and provide itself more power, more negotiating abilities. And these problems are big. Why? Because they lead to consequences. Russia continues to act as a destabilizing force within Europe. They become bolstered in campaigns of election interference and things eventually like war. Being able to have this is a big problem because we don't want Russia undermining the legitimacy of the EU and at the same time causing problems and conflicts that only gives power to Russia, which in the past and through precedent has led to a lot of issues not only in conflict, but the global political image. This leads our second contention, case studies. Again, our second contention is case studies. It's important to see how the aforementioned impacts would actually play out. We demonstrated what they are, now let's see how they actually work in today's society. Look towards the most prominent, likely secessionist states, Scotland. Our first subcontention is subcontention A, Scotland. We can see that during the first independence referendum campaign in 2014, the SNP-led the Scottish government placed importance on the need for continued EU membership for Scotland. That's according to a Brexit report happening this year. Basically, what that means is that Scotland, if it wants to secede, it would need EU support. And Scotland itself has promised peace if it was able to gain independence and assist with the EU. But if it doesn't have assistance from the EU, the possibility of conflicts continue to rise. This leads to a few impacts. First, the economic impacts, which we talked about in contention 1. Since the EU doesn't want to work with Scotland, And Scotland doesn't have an opportunity to grow its economy as an independent state. It leads to a lot of economic impacts. First of all, like citizens aren't able to negotiate and trade. They aren't able to become legitimized on the political scale. A lot of problems when it comes to economic impacts, and also the possibility of turning towards Russia. This is a big impact for Scotland because they promise peace and they need that EU support. The second impact is the public support. It literally goes against the will of Scotland. It's important to understand that in our democratic state, or in the democratic necessity of the EU, going for public support for independence is being undermined because public support and public state of Scotland wants there to be EU support and they want to be in a part of the EU membership. But that's not happening because of the problem that they aren't being a part of it. This leads to our second sub-contention of Catalonia. We've seen it through Scotland. Let's analyze it through Catalonia as well. Catalonia, and we've said this themselves, would lose membership of the EU if it were to declare independence from Spain, a development that would have serious economic consequences for this affluent region. This is according to Atlantic Council's Fran Burwell. Catalonia has constantly protested and fought for independence in an effort to escape the various problems in Spain. Yet this driving force for freedom is exceedingly difficult without admission to the EU. Catalonia's public opinion proves that the vast majority want EU admission, but it isn't looking possible. The Atlantic Council recently reported that this means that the barriers will go up immediately. No free movement for people who have Catalonian passports, no free movement of goods and services, and the relationship with the euro will be suspect. There would be no common agricultural policy money for Catalonia. Again, that's from the Atlantic Council. And so what we're seeing throughout these examples is that without admission to the EU, a lot of problems have been arising. Not only would not admitting Catalonia into the EU would hurt the Catalonian people through the economy, but also it would increase tensions that would obviously exist between them and Spain. This could pose problems for future war, future violence that we don't want to see. This also links to the economic harm we talked about with possible political ties to Russia, all of which prove that the reason that the affirmative wins today's round is because at the end of the day, we have to provide EU membership. Thank you.
All right, I'm back. Just to confirm, I'm April Mao, first and third on the neg from Campolindo, and an off-time roadmap. I'm just going to be going over negation's case and then onto the affirmations case for some refutations. All right. Is everyone ready? Okay. Then my time begins now. So jumping right into it, right onto the first disad, which is just going to be of violence. So uniqueness for what's happening in the status quo right now. Number one is that we see that there's actually a lot of violent things like decreasing. So point A here is that support for Catalan separatists are declining. They say that there are a majority. However, the truth is that after 4 regional elections in 8 years, they have never actually attracted more than 50% of the popular vote anymore, which means that like this support is actually declining. So point B is here is that the 2 laws proposed by the separatist bloc to quote disconnect from Spain, which laid the groundwork for the October 1 vote, were passed with barely 50% of support for like Catalan parliament, which means that like support for Catalonian dependence is like generally increasing. So point C is that for 70 years we've experienced peace in most of Europe, and most people alive today are no doubt conditioned to think that like the stability in the international system is the default state of being. But the reality is our relatively peaceful continent is only that way because everyone has kind of broadly accepted the same rules. So the second uniqueness here is that violence is still on a brink. Like if we like have people like not right now, thank you. We see that violence is still on a brink because these groups are still there and they still have like agendas despite the dwindling support. The third thing here is also more on Catalonia, is that just like Catalonians in general are just doing well right now. We see that Catalans have are more educated and have lower unemployment than the Spanish average, and they enjoy a regional government with like extensive powers in tax matters, education, public services, and they are able to like use and promote their own language. So Catalonians are doing well right now. So the links is that they, with the affirmations plan, the affirmation literally tells you that Catalonians going to be able to get independent and stuff. And we're going to tell you that that's going to be really bad. Specifically, number one here is that the plan leads to more violence, because now there is an incentive to leave Spain, meaning that more separatist groups there are more likely to be active now. It doesn't matter if these separatist groups even have like people supporting them, because they will still act on their own and cause more violence. The second link here is also you're going to be leading, if Catalonia becomes independent, there's going to be a lot of redrawing of borders, and this is going to be destabilizing Europe. So subpoint A is that this would disrupt the link, as the first link that I tell you about, because now we have a completely new country that Spain is probably going to be really angry at. Number two is that, according to Open Democracy, if we accept such self-serving and irresponsible arguments in one case, the whole Europe will be gone. This is also why, like, Putin wants to help the Catalan cause and stuff. It's because it enfeebles Europe and makes Europe weaker. So we obviously don't want that to happen. Someone see here's also a slippery slope. So more places than ever want to leave their home country. For example, Venice from Italy, which is also really going to be destabilizing and stuff. So yeah. So impacts here, number one is just a local impact is that there would be a divided Catalonia, because not all citizens support separation, which means that there's going to be a lot of violence against the citizens there. And also there's going to be many independent supporters that are wealthy and stuff that are going to be subsidizing like poor people in Spain and stuff, which means that there's going to be even higher tensions between the classes. Number two, second impact is just in general is that you're going to have a destabilized Europe and therefore more violence and stuff, because a lot of separatist groups are going to be using like violent methods in order to protest their cause, and this is going to be like a threat to all the other countries. So yeah, onto the second disad, which is just going to be about the economy. So we see that in the uniqueness, we see that many countries' econ are actually recovering in the status quo. So point A is that look to a really sharp rebound in the Spain econ even after COVID, and this was very recent. So we see that like a lot of countries in the EU, their like economies are going up. Specifically here is onto the links is that they lead to, the first link is that they lead to a separation of states, which is really bad for the economy. So let's look at the two instances that the affirmation brings up. So first, on the instance of Scotland, we see that Scotland is going to be getting literally 2.6 to 7.8 times higher the losses than any other state if they were to secede from the EU and stuff. So it would be really, really bad for them and would like result in the loss of nearly 2% in their GDP. And in the instance of Catalonia, they would also, one economic report said that it would result in, quote, a loss of jobs and also nearly a 2% decrease in the Spanish GDP yearly, which means that like ultimately we see that it's just bad for both countries, for Catalonia and Spain, when we have like these countries seceding and stuff. But the second link here is going to be perceptual, and it's going to be of investor confidence. We see that if investors see a lot of this like fluctuation, if investors see that there's going to be a lot of like countries wanting to secede and stuff, they're going to want to pull out their investments because they're not sure how the economy will look like, which means that we're going to have a lot of investor freak out, which is going to be really bad, because investor confidence is ultimately what's going to be key to growth in a lot of these countries, which means that it's going to lead to a lot of economic collapse. Now, the impacts here is economic collapse, but there's also that really specific impact of since the EU and a lot of these countries trade with a lot of other countries, there's going to be world spillover. If like Catalonia and like economy collapses, then it's going to lead to spillover in like the rest of the EU and stuff, which is probably, and the rest of the world, which is probably really bad. But yeah. Moving on to the affirmations case. So onto their first ad about how EU needs to be like united and stuff. They try to tell you here on their impacts, they tell you about like political instability, but we're going to tell you one, Catalonia is not key to European Union stability, but however, Spain as a larger country is, which means that if Catalonia were to leave Spain, it's probably going to lead to even more political instability. Moving on, they tell you about economic stability. We're going to tell you turn this against them because they end up making economic stability worse. Cross apply what I told you about how like Spain will basically have their GDP literally drop 2% every single year, which is probably going to decrease their economic contributions to the EU, which is probably really bad. But even if you don't buy that, it would still be bad because investor confidence in the perceptual link. Moving on, they tell you about how like the alternative is to work with Russia. Two responses here. Number one is Catalonia is working with Russia won't really matter because the Catalonia right now does not have independence. Once we give Catalonia independence, then that's when Russia is going to come in, because they see that Catalonian independence is going to weaken the EU, and that's when they come in, which is probably really bad. Also, the second response here is simply that the affirmation gives you a lot of evidence and warrants about how Russia really wants to work with Catalonia and really wants to work with these countries. But they give you no warrants as to why, all of a sudden, with their plan, magically Russia is just not going to take interest anymore. We're going to tell you, as Negation is going to tell you, that Russia is still going to interfere in the EU matters, because the way that Russia works as a country, we see the past with past precedents, is that if they want to do something, they will do it, even if it they don't really care about international relations and stuff. So Russia is just kind of going to be a non-unique piece of offense for both sides. But yeah. Moving on, they tell you about, on their second point, is that on their case studies, they tell you about how Scotland needs EU support. But we're going to tell you that Scotland's accession is actually bad, because nearly 63% of Scottish people don't want independence. So there is no public support for independence. So it's probably bad. Also, just another thing in general is that they don't really prove that the affirmation doesn't really prove that the status quo for the econ is bad right now. So we're going to tell you that the status quo for the economy is good, and thus we do not need the affirmations plan, because the economy is good right now. We should leave it as it is. Thank you, Judge. And this is why the nation should win today's debate.
Alrighty. So brief off time. I'll first be going over, well, I'll start on our opponent's case, going down the flow, but starting out with a broad, just overarching, thing I want to establish in the debate, then going on to defend our own case. With that, our judges and opponents ready? Cool. Let me just get my timer, some water. All right, Mohammed and I are still proud to affirm the resolution. The EU should automatically offer membership to any state that successfully secedes from a current or former EU member state. Now, looking at our opponent's case, there are two broad overarching problems with it. The first of which is that pretty much all of their links boil down to the idea that if the EU does offer automatic membership to independent states, then that's going to incentivize states to secede. They don't really touch on any impacts related to, what happens when a state actually does secede. And that's, exactly the second problem with their entire case, that being that all their impacts aren't really focused on the resolution. They're focused on why secession is bad. We can agree that A, secession is bad, but B, that if a state does secede, then it's still in the best interest of the EU to admit that state. Those are two separate issues that we must consider when going through our opponent's case. Starting out with their first dissent on violence, I'm going to skip their uniqueness points and go straight into their first link, because their first link is really interesting. They say that our plan leads to more violence because it will incentivize Catalonia to leave Spain. But their entire three uniqueness points are all about how there are different incentives right now against Catalonia actually leaving Spain. They talk about how support for the Catalan independence movement is going down. They talk about how Catalonia right now is doing well. These are stronger incentives for Catalonia to remain in Spain and not to secede, as compared to the EU making it a policy to automatically admit Catalonia into the European Union. This link doesn't make any sense because it literally conflicts with their uniqueness points. And this can be said about their other links as well. They talk a lot about the instability that would be caused by Catalonia's secession, like the redrawing of borders and their impacts they go into. They talk about a divided Catalonia and destabilizing Europe. Once again, going back to what I said earlier, we are not debating whether or not secession is in the best interest of Catalonia or the EU. We are simply debating whether or not, if Catalonia were to secede, if the EU should admit them. There are a few reasons why that would still be in their best interest. Firstly, turning this dissent on the point of violence. The EU needs to have control over both Catalonia and Spain in that instance if it wants to be any meaningful broker of peace. They can't be that if they don't have Catalonia in the EU. If they're negotiating with a third party instead of two nations that are part of the EU. So in the event that Catalonia does secede, violence actually goes up. And that same thing applies to their second dissent of the economy. Now moving on to their second dissent of
POI.
economic impacts. Oh yeah, sure, I'll take your POI.
Could you give me any reasons besides as to like lower, like no support from the EU as to why Catalonia wouldn't want independence right now?
Well, the reasons that you gave in your speech, your first uniqueness is about how, Catalonian like separatist support is declining. Your third uniqueness about how Catalonians are doing well right now. Like these incentives are like a lot bigger than the EU making it a policy to automatically grant, membership to seceded states. Now, moving on to the second disad, that being of economic impacts. Once again, the uniqueness about how like right now, like European nations are doing good. They talk about how separatism would like cause a lot of job loss in Spain. And we agree. Anytime like Scotland, Catalonia, Flanders, any nation that would secede, in the immediate, that would cause economic harm. But then you have to turn to the question, how can the EU best solve for the economic impacts of secession? And the answer is through the affirmation plan by fast-tracking the admissions processes for these nations. And there are a few reasons why like admission would better avoid economic collapse. Firstly is the idea of trade. The European Union does not want another situation like that with Britain, where they spend months upon months negotiating a trade deal that at the end of the day causes tariffs to go up, limits trade, and thus limits economic prosperity. They need to fast-track admission to create, a like sustainable single market with countries like Catalonia and Scotland in the event that they are going to secede. And that like takes out many of their links, specifically their link 2 about investor confidence. Investors are more confident in a single market with the European Union, as opposed to the European Union have to negotiate with more states like Britain. And secondly, once again, you link out to political instability and Russia. The EU needs control over Europe if it wants to create like a market that is actually prosperous, if it actually wants investors to be confident. So once again, you turn to the question, not of whether or not secession in the immediate is economically harmful, but how are we going to solve for that economic harm? You don't solve for that economic harm by isolating states like Catalonia and Scotland in the event that they do secede. You solve for it by admitting them, by creating a single market and actually allowing the economy to prosper. With that, let's move on to our own case, starting out with our contention 1. They move straight into the impact, starting about with like political instability. They talk about how in our world, political instability would go up because like Catalonia is not key to like Europe, but Spain is. But that's exactly the point, is that there will be tension in the event that Catalonia secedes between Spain and Catalonia. The EU needs to better control that tension. And the best way to control that tension is that they are both member states. That's literally the key link here that they completely neglect. Move on to our second point about economic instability. They like reparrot, their second disad about like secession making like economic instability worse. Once again, we can agree that secession is harmful to the economy, but that the best way to solve for that harm is to automatically admit EU member states. And lastly, they have two responses to our third impact about Russia. Firstly, they once again go on about Catalonia, saying how like independence won't really affect Russia, how it like doesn't matter to Russia. However, this is our exact point, that Catalonia with independence would want to turn to Russia and would become more important to Russia in that event. We don't want Russia to continue encroaching upon smaller nations and encroaching upon Europe's borders. And that links directly into their second response, that being like, why would Russia even want to become involved in Catalonia in the first place? Well, it's exactly that they want to destabilize Europe. Catalonia would become important to Europe in the event that Russia continues to encroach upon them. Europe does not want to become destabilized. They need control over all nations within the continent. Moving on to contention 2, the idea of case studies. They really only responded to our subpoint A about Scotland simply by saying that 63% of people in Scotland don't support independence. Okay, then that's not really relevant to today's debate, because we're not debating whether or not Scotland is likely to secede, whether or not they should secede. We're debating, in the event that they do secede, like what is the best course of action? So once again, with like the minute I have left, I'd like to kind of reiterate the thing that I opened with in today's debate. Like the fundamental misunderstanding that our opponents seem to have, like the approach that we need to take in today's resolution. Today's resolution, it's not about secession. It's not about whether or not secession is likely. It's not about whether or not secession is good. It's not about whether or not people in Europe or people in countries that are secede, are likely to secede in the first place, whether or not they support secession. It's about like a theoretical idea of in the event, if Flanders, if Catalonia, if Scotland, in the event that any of these places are to secede, what should the European Union do? And, for all the impacts that we bring up, for political instability, for economic instability, for trying to curb Russia's hegemony, it is clear that the best course of action is simply to admit them into a unified Europe. The EU cannot stand with rogue member states right up next to their borders. They need a unified Europe to provide economic prosperity, political prosperity, and ultimately for these reasons, you must vote for the affirmative in today's debate.
Okay, so the order is just going to be kind of just an overview on the resolution and everything kind of about that. And then it's just going to be the neg case and then the aff case in the order that they were read. All right. If anyone is not ready, I have 8 minutes and my time begins now. So starting on just some overarching analysis, ultimately what the affirmation tries to argue is that we're not arguing the benefits of secession. So basically what the negation's point here is that when you do the affirmations plan, this is an incentive for countries to secede. Since their plan, and we're proving that it's a direct incentive for countries to secede and leave, sorry, not countries, but parts of countries to secede and leave their unions, this basically means that the affirmation plan leads to the secession. That is why we are arguing that secession is specifically bad, because it is a direct impact of the affirmations plan. So kind of just after going over that, let's talk about the first disad of violence. So continuing, just a couple things on the uniqueness. So one thing specifically that I bring up in the POI is I ask my opponent to basically give me reasoning as to why, any reasoning other than having this incentive of this disincentive for not seceding because they won't be part of the EU anymore. And the speaker doesn't really bring up any reasons as to why Catalonians don't have reasons to secede. They basically just say, look at the uniqueness. However, the uniqueness I specifically give you is that this violence is decreasing because there is no incentive to secede, because they know that they won't be a part of the European Union. This basically, we have isolated this as the only reason as to why Catalonia is still part of Spain, still receiving all those economic benefits, and why Spain is still receiving the economic benefits from Catalonia being a part of them. And the affirmation has not given you any other reason as to why this isn't going to be true, meaning it's 100% true that if you provide this incentive, then Catalonia, there will be more violence, and all of our links are going to be true because there will be more redrawing of borders and more destabilization to Europe. So that's going to be 100% true if you buy our uniqueness points there. And since the affirmation doesn't bring you up anything, don't let them bring it up in the PMR. So basically, that kind of covers everything on the first disad. Now talking about the second one, basically extend over our uniqueness points. Specifically, we talk about how the uniqueness is really, really good right now. Many countries' economies are recovering in the status quo, specifically Spain having a really, really sharp rebound. If you buy over our uniqueness, it's probably a reason not to vote for the affirmations plan because things are going so well right now. We probably don't want to do anything to potentially destabilize it. Even if you buy that there's a 1% chance that our links are going to happen, it's still a reason to vote for the negation because things are so good right now and we don't want to disrupt that. Look at all the points I give you as to how not only are the Spanish people happy, but also Catalonians are happy because they are more educated, have lower unemployment, and are enjoying regional government vested with extensive powers in tax matter and education. Things are going really, really well right now, which is a reason not to do the affirmations plan. But now going on to even proving the links. So obviously my opponents agree that seceding is bad and secession is bad. So if you buy that their plan is 1% leading to secession, then it should be a reason to vote for the negation. Even if you don't buy that, our investor confidence link is still specifically going to stand because specifically if investors view this as a reason that other countries are going to want to secede, and look at the fact that we bring up to many countries are kind of starting many other unions are starting to feel this way. For example, Venice, there's a lot of independence in Venice and a movement happening there, and Scotland and everything. So if investors feel this is a motivation for other countries to start destabilizing things, you can definitely bet that investor confidence is going to go down. And this has a huge impact because usually investor confidence makes up about 20% of exports, and it also deals with how businesses are going to get more and more money and capital. So no matter if countries actually cede or not, investor confidence is specifically going to go down. So this perceptual link still stands. Just another quick thing to extend on the link, specifically extend that even with EU membership, especially we take this as an example with Spain, economists still say that there would be a 2% GDP loss for Spain yearly if Catalonia secedes. So this basically means that even if we give EU membership, countries still aren't going to do well after secession, meaning the affirmation has very, very little solvency here and very little magnitude impacts. So that kind of covers everything there. Now moving on to the affirmation case. So talking about their first advantage, they talk about how the EU basically needs this united Europe. However, kind of what we're arguing is that the turn to this is that they make the united Europe a lot worse for a couple of reasons. So basically, the first thing is that the affirmation literally tells you that Catalonia's main goal is to destabilize the EU, to destabilize Europe, and destabilize the European Union. This is probably a reason it should not be included in the European Union, because specifically, if we have Catalonia and we bring it into the EU automatically just because it secedes, then possibly like if you say, and like, the affirmation argues that like they would turn to Russia, there is a possibility that Russia could begin like to infiltrate the European Union. It's just like a lot of issues that we probably don't want to bring up. The second point here as to why they destabilize specifically is because, again, you give this incentive for other people to like cede from their countries, as I talk about in the first disadvantage. So now talking about the second advantage about case studies. So the main point that they bring up in like when they're answering our refutations is that it doesn't matter if Scottish people don't want independence. However, basically, I think like what we're trying to say here, if I can like explain it more clearly, is that in the uniqueness, the countries like the motivation to secede, Scotland like is going down. Like 63% of people do not want Scotland to leave. They want to stay and they want to have things as they are. And the same thing is happening for Catalonia. Again, so all of these like major things that like might happen, the probability of that in the status quo is going down. Now, what that means is that the affirmation plan has very, very little solvency because their plan is reliant on all of the like small benefits that their plan like might even reap in the first place are reliant on these countries actually ceding in the first place. This means that they have like a very, very little probability of any of their impacts actually happening in the first place because yeah, go ahead, POI.
Yeah, so you're talking about how like our impacts have a low probability of actually happening, but considering that the resolution does call for us to like imagine a theoretical world where states do secede, like how is this exactly relevant to the debate?
Okay, thank you for that question. So it's specifically relevant because it's like comparing the two different impacts from each of our sides. The negation, right? We have impacts that we know are happening specifically right now. People are happy right now. Things are going well right now. And we are specifically arguing that we should not risk everything that is happening right now that you guys have not provided any counters for and all the good things happening in the status quo for a very theoretical situation that we are proving has very, very low probability. Even though this is something that we're arguing in the first place, it's important to consider the actual implications of when this would happen in the argument. So that's why I'm just saying that we should prefer a known status quo better over basically this like really theoretical impact that has a lot of low probability and low magnitude as well. Yeah, so just basically continuing on their second advantage of case studies, just extend what we talked to you about how like Scottish people don't want independence, so there's probably not a chance that they're going to cede, meaning that the affirmation has a lot of low probability impacts here, which is going to like mean that they don't have a lot of solvency. However, if you look at the negations, like we give you a bunch of warrants specifically as to why the economy is going to decrease for both countries if they cede, meaning there's little motivation to cede right now. However, if the EU were to say that they would provide protection if Catalonia were to secede, we give you like a specific link as to how that would incentivize the violence happening in Catalonia, and it would incentivize all of these separatist groups who are still around, even though their support for them is specifically dwindling. For all those reasons, I would urge a strong vote for the negation side of this debate, specifically because we have the highest probability and magnitude impacts of this debate, and we give you the clearest link chains as to what we know is happening specifically right now. In conclusion, like the affirmation gives you no reason as to why the status quo is bad. So don't vote just off of this like really like theoretical and super, super small chance that this will happen when we know that things are good right now and there's no reason to change it. Thank you.
All right, hello, off-time roadmap. It's just gonna be weighing, so I recommend just like for people to just probably take out another sheet and just like put weighing on that sheet, because I'm not really gonna go like on the flow. I'm just gonna go down on weighing. So yeah, a separate sheet is recommended. But yeah, if everyone is ready, My time starts now. So jumping right into it, you're going to be ultimately voting for a negation today on the economy, because the whole whether or not they secede like kind of thing is a wash, but economic collapse is going to happen like no matter what. So let's look at why economic impacts come first. Number one is that economic impacts have really high probability of happening. We've proved to you that if under their plan, like investors will pull out, things will pull out, which means that it has a really, really high probability chance of happening. But the second reason why econ impacts come first is also because it has such a high magnitude. Look to the fact that in the event of an economic collapse, like people are going to suffer, and there's going to be a lot of people that are going to die, and there's going to be and death is going to be irreversible, which means that it's going to be a really, really big impact, because economic collapse just has so many like spillover effects and stuff. So that's why economic impacts come first. So moving on to why negation is winning the econ debate. So 5 reasons why negation is winning the econ debate. The first reason is that we prove that countries are going to want to secede. So some may secede, some may succeed in withdrawing, some may not, but we prove that even if one country does secede, that's still going to be bad for their econ. Cross-apply that whole 2% and the job loss thing. The second reason here is specifically that perceptual thing. No matter what the outcome is, we prove that there's going to be investor confidence freak out, because investors won't know if countries will succeed in pulling out or not. And so they're going to pull out their money no matter what, just in case that these countries do secede, which means that in either world, no matter what, if countries secede, there's still going to be investor freak out, and there's still going to be people pulling out their investments. It's perceptual. Now, this is really, really key, because affirmation drops this whole perceptual part. They drop that even if countries don't secede, people still freak out, which means that we're ultimately winning there too. The third reason why we went on the econ debate is because they concede that the investor confidence is key to the economy, which means that we have 100% linkage into their impacts, and we have the biggest impact, which is number 4, which is that we have the biggest magnitude impact scenario, because we talk about world spillover, not just about the EU, because the EU trades with other countries. So we just in general have the biggest magnitude impact scenario. And the fifth reason why we're winning on economy is because the affirmation concedes that the economy right now in the status quo is doing good, which means that you vote neg here, because that means that affirmation does not need their plan, because the status quo is good and we keep the status quo. So onto some preempts. Number 1, don't let them come up here and say that we got the res wrong, because we didn't. And even if we did get the res wrong, and even if people don't secede, we still win on the whole investor confidence thing. And also, don't let them come up here and say that, oh, we don't get any impacts because countries won't secede, because once again, the whole investor thing. Also, it's a double bind cross apply with my partner, and I tell you about how basically the app has no solvency either. Basically, at the end of the day, judges, if you want to buy the affirmations case, you need to remember 2 things. Number 1, you have to buy that this theoretical case would happen soon enough that even though they have provided you no reasons why it would. The second reason why is the second thing for you to have to buy the AF case is that you have to buy the EU membership would even counter all of the economic losses, which is just simply not possible because of how big of an impact the economic loss has, not only on the country, but also because on the EU in general, because of investor freak out. Ultimately, the affirmation just is not winning on the economic debate, and we proved to you that economic debate is the number 1 thing today. So thank you, Judge, and it is a very clear ballot for the negation.
All right, thank you. So for a brief off-time roadmap, judges, first I'll be going over clarifications, and then moving on to key points of clash in the round, and then moving on to voter issues. So is anyone not ready? Cool. Start the time on my first word. If the negation case could be summarized with one phrase, it would be all defense, no offense. Within the round, we've talked about a lot of things, specifically when it comes to the theoretical part of the resolution. Judges, read the resolution yourself. It's saying, in the theoretical case that a country secedes, what should we do about that? Should we automatically offer the membership or should we not? This itself, by natural, is a theoretical resolution. And looking at that idea, we can analyze the negations case and tell you why it falls down. The key point in everything in their case relies upon this idea that by providing automatic membership, that it would incentivize these other countries to secede and form their own unions. First of all, Anthony comes up here and tells you, and we get no response to this, that it's not a major incentive for them to do it. It largely results a lot because of political, economic, and cultural issues. Do you really believe that a country will secede just because, after years of staying together, all because of that, just because of the fact that there's automatic membership? No. It may be that tipping point. It may be a small factor, but in no way is that an incentive. And this is where their entire case falls apart. Because years and years of people coming together isn't going to be stopped by the possibility and the incentive of having membership in the EU. They also bring about this key point of clash about how more destabilization leads to violence. Basically, that if they're going to secede, that it's going to lead to violence. First of all, Anthony already brought this up, but the fact of the matter is that more destabilization comes when they aren't a part of the EU. Why? Because when they're not part of the EU, what's happening is that they're conflicting with the other region, and there isn't a unification process. In our first contention, we brought you about this idea of how the EU membership provides some unification and provides a way of coming together. And that if that's gone, what happens is that the countries continue to clash, and oftentimes and sometimes they go to war and they revolt. This destabilization in the short term, yes, may be a small factor, but in the long term, what happens is that when you don't provide EU membership, there isn't unification, and that violence and conflict continues to get worse. They also talk about this idea of investor confidence. And Anthony also talked about this idea, talking about the short term and the long term. Investor confidence, yes, will go down for a brief moment when they secede from the union. Why? Because like any investment, it's uncertain. But what happens, it provides a safer space for investors. Think about it like this. If you're an investor and you know that they're going to become a part of the EU, where they will get support for their economic problems, where countries like the ones we've mentioned in our second will get, yeah.
I might not have caught it, but is like the analysis that it's like the turn on investor confidence a new argument that it's actually going to be better for investor confidence if you...
Yeah, it's not a new argument. Anthony basically brought up that it's going to be a safer space for investors, and we're kind of just going into the nuance of that, just breaking it down. After all, it's up to the judge's discretion, and yeah. Is that all? All right, cool. I'll resume the time right now. So like Anthony said, it provides a safer space for investors in the long run because obviously when they have that support from the EU, problems like political conflicts, economic problems, they will have their back when it comes to that support. But also, when we're looking at the low probability arguments and high magnitude that they're talking about, we can actually see that the probability arguments don't matter in the context of the resolution, because the probability that they secede from the union or secede from that country is already the theoretical case of the resolution. The resolution is already assuming that that low probability problem already happens. And that's where the negation continues to fall apart, that their low probability argument has already happened because the resolution itself implies that that theoretical problem has already existed. So when looking at the voter issues, let's look at some key concepts. First, that of the political and the economical state of the resolution. When it comes to the political, we see, as I mentioned earlier, no office from the negation side. So what happens when these countries do secede? Maybe they don't have automatic EU membership. What happens to the two countries we brought about in our second contentions when they secede in the negation world? In the negation world, countries like Catalonia and Scotland don't have support, and oftentimes will resort to Russian support, and in many cases will lead to long, everlasting conflict. They can't survive on their own. And the problem with the negation stance is that we're not providing support for them, and they will continue going down this rabbit hole where they won't have the opportunity to live as a sovereign, autonomous state. And the second part is the economy. The investor part of this resolution is the only thing that the negation has. But we tell you through reports of how economic problems, specifically when I mentioned in my first speech of how the Atlantic Council was talking about Catalonia and how they need support if they secede because they don't have that economic support, that will go away. Whereas in the negation world, they won't have that economic support. And even if they secede, what is the negation going to do in that case? They won't do anything. And so it turns into this case of who's doing something and who is doing nothing. And at the end of the day, we understand that the affirmative provides a valuable reason and a valuable way for the economy to go up through EU support, and that this probability of investment is in the short term and not the long term. And so for all of these reasons, Anthony and I are proud to affirm. Thank you.
No worries, no worries. Sure, I can go first. First thing I want to say is, hey, congratulations to everyone to making it to TUCs. And I hope this has been a really nice experience so far, and I hope it is for the rest of the tournament. In terms of my decision, I ultimately voted for side opposition. And my thinking was that we can start with the resolutional interpretation first. There was this debate about, is the resolution like presupposing that a state has seceded, or is it just like a general motion? And I think I do agree with side opposition here that the motion doesn't assume that a state or like states have seceded. I think it just says like, in the case that a state does, we should offer membership. Yeah, I don't fully see the phrase or the reading as to how the resolution basically presupposes that as like a condition in terms of debate. But even if I were to buy the Gov's argument, I tried to view the round under both like interpretations of the resolutions. I think I'm still comfortable voting for side op under both. And my reasoning is that the impact work and the weighing work that the opposition does in both rebuttal speeches is pretty cleanly flowed throughout the round, and also is warranted a lot. Namely, the investors' argument, the weighing started in the second opposition speech and then was finished and carried through in the final opposition speech. So because I have this like pretty cleanly flowed argument, and I'm explaining how it outweighs on probability, magnitude, I think I remember there might have been something else, but I remember there were like multiple weighing mechanisms. I felt comfortable with voting on that. In terms of the Gov, I definitely think that you two went for the right argument, that you two went for the argument about destabilization. The reason why I didn't vote for this is because I just want to hear more warrants and impacts. Because in the first Gov speech, I think there's really, really solid work in terms of like outlining what is like the link chain, right? Like how is this argument fully warranted? And also I'm told a lot about the impacts, like in terms of political destabilization, about economic destabilization, and about trade deals and how that takes a long time. So I'm told like multiple different layers as to how destabilization is bad. But then in the rebuttal speeches, I am not told or I don't get these same extensions of the impacts of this sort of like warranting. And I feel like had there had been like more thorough extensions of the impacts, and also you to do weighing to like match the opposition's weighing, I could definitely see a world in which I vote for side gov. So in short, I voted for side op because there were cleanly extended impacts that were weighed. Definitely could have voted for gov. I just wanted to hear that sort of like clarity and explanation that was started in the gov constructed, like carried throughout the entire round. But yeah, those are my thoughts on the round.
I also voted op. I didn't think it was like the greatest round in terms of clash. It did kind of come down to probabilities and costs, particularly given that Gov conceded that secession is bad, which I don't necessarily think they had to do. But once they made that decision, then it was like, do we live in a world where secession, and we're only talking about Catalonia and Scotland, like we left ourselves in that position. Is it very low probability that will happen, extremely high probability that will happen, or kind of knife's edge middle? And I don't think either side did a great job of engaging with the probability arguments, but Opp did a better job. And I don't agree with the theoretical argument at all. Like the way I read the resolution is that the EU's making a policy, and that policy will have implications for incentives to secede. So I agree with Kevin on that, maybe even more strongly. So, given that we don't want succession, the question is how bad is succession? And then what's the probability of succession? And Campo basically said that the status quo is kind of fine, but like not ideal. Risk of succession is going down. It's still kind of in the air. And Gov kind of barely engaged with that argument. I have it on my flow. It's like, I think in the rebuttal, it's like, oh, this isn't a major incentive. We're at a tipping point. It's just a small factor, and then moved on. And I think kind of you were hoping to hang your hat on the theoretical point. So, so that's where I kind of came out. I don't think you had to concede that succession was a good thing, I don't think you had to concede that succession is bad, because like in some cases, maybe succession's good. And then Opp, you didn't need to, you could have fought harder. Like, we don't want to, even if someone secedes, I keep saying succeeds. Even if someone secedes, you don't want to necessarily say that automatic is good. Like, what if someone that seceded was, what if someone who seceded was like a fascist group or something that's totally inconsistent with the EU ways? So the automatic language, I think, gave you more room. You could have spent more time arguing that, hey, even if this is theoretical, or even if we just found out tomorrow that someone seceded, that's not automatic is not necessarily the best policy. So in any event, sorry, that's a bit of a ramble, but that's where I came out.
All right, thank you so much, judges.
And by the way, that's it for my RFD. I just do oral RFD.
Sounds good.
Okay, bye.
Thank you.
All
Good
right,
round.
see you guys. Good luck in your future
Round,
rounds.
guys. Thank you so much for judging.
Bye.